Good afternoon, East Coast participants. Good morning to the rest of us. Thank you very much for coming. This is Ben Ruddle. I'm on the faculty at Northern Arizona University, and I'm the lead PI on the Fusion project. That is the Mesoscale data fusion to map and model the U.S. Food, Energy, and Water Systems project. It's funded by the National Science Foundation and the U.S. Department of Agriculture under the INFUSE program. We have a number of scientists involved in this project, quite a few actually. You can read more about the project on our website, which is fusion.us, FEWSION.us. It's a pretty good website. It's got lots of information. Check out our podcasts, our news, the papers that have been written, and soon in March, hopefully, if all goes according to plan, by the end of March, we will have a really cool online visualization system launched where you can see an initial version of what we've produced describing the U.S. food, energy, water system in an online interface. This is the first cyber seminar in a series of 6 every Wednesday at 1 p.m. Eastern. They run until March 13th. Chris Lant is giving the first one. Thank you very much to CUAHSI for hosting these cyber seminars. I think it's a great service to the community, and being able to advertise this to the members and get people to attend for free from across the country is a great service. Let me introduce Chris and his talk. So Chris's talk is titled Human Appropriated Net Primary Productivity in U.S. Agriculture. Chris is a professor at Utah State University. He is also a chair in his program there. And if you look back at Chris's history, I think you'll see that he is one of the maybe unsung early pioneers of this field. He wrote some of the earliest and I think most interesting papers on issues of water footprinting, for instance, and its role in agriculture. And so we're really happy to have him on our team. And I hope you're excited to learn what he's working on right now. With no further ado, let me turn it over to Chris and ask the CUAHSI staff to push the right button so that he can get started. Chris, go ahead.
Well, good morning to everybody. At least it's morning out here in Utah. My name is Chris Lant. If you've met me, it's probably because I was the executive director of the university's Council on Water Resources from 2002 to 2012 before I moved to Utah State. What I'm going to talk about today is kind of a 2-part presentation. And first, I want to show you a few things about the Fusion project as a whole before dipping into human appropriation of net primary productivity. So our project that Ben Ruddle is PI for is Mesoscale data fusion to map and model the U.S. food, energy, water system. Funded by the INFUSE program. And on this first slide, you can see what a big team that Ben put together with researchers from Northern Arizona, Utah State, Illinois, Lehigh, Penn State, Colorado, and as well as some of the federal think tanks and labs. So it's a big team. And what I'm going to talk about first in this two-part presentation is an overview of the project as a whole. And in doing that, I'm going to be drawing from a paper that's coming out in Ambio. It'll be out in print soon, but it's been out for some months online. And that DOI that I've listed there is where you could go ahead and read the paper to get a sense of direction of how this INFUSE project is developing. And then I'll talk about human appropriation of net primary productivity that my team with my graduate student Suman, who's sitting next to me, and Stanley Mubako are working on. So Fusion is a big data blueprint type of project. And the overall strategy is to combine resource footprinting with examination of supply chains in order to develop a network analysis at the mesoscale. So resource footprinting would include water footprint, blue and green being important differences there, blue being water withdrawals, whereas green water is evapotranspiration by ring-fed crops. nutrient footprints, carbon footprint, embedded energy, and then I'll focus a little bit on human appropriation or net primary productivity, which has 17 syllables. So we'll combine that and just call it HAMP. And taking these footprints and looking at them at various locations within complex supply chains, so trade, transfer over major forms of commercial and freight transportation, highways, railroads, pipelines, power lines, barges. And that allows us to transfer a water footprint into virtual water, HAMP into embodied HAMP. And then when we have that put together, it's available to network analysis, where we can examine vulnerability and resistance within the network, response to shocks and stresses, evolution of this system over the last few decades of US history. And it's a mesoscale analysis, where, as we'll see, scales like counties, cities, small watersheds are the scale at which the system is best captured, because most of the food, energy, and water is being traded among those mesoscale entities. Okay, and this is part of the big fusion project funded by NSF. So looking at an example, in this case of livestock-based food, we can break out the supply chain and then look at how the footprints are pertinent to different stages on that supply chain. So here's a supply chain for animal-based food, where grazing and feed crop production are at the beginning, feedlot and dairy facilities, and then it goes to food processing, where it goes to grocery stores, restaurants, and to the final consumer. And there's different resource inputs and emissions at different stages in the supply chain. So remembering that footprints can apply to either a resource commitment, such as water pumped for irrigation or green water that falls as rain, or nutrient inputs to make the crops grow better, or emissions to a limited environmental sink. So, carbon in the atmosphere, or nitrogen and phosphorus runoff represent those kinds of footprints. So a food energy system is really a component of the overall social environmental system that's very big and very complex. Within that larger system, there's a core part that we would think of as the FUSE system, the food energy water system. But that red dotted line is dotted because there's really no boundary. So trade in food, production of food and energy, and trade, the grid, are core components of the FUSE system. But there's no dividing line between the FUSE system and other things like supporting and regulatory ecosystem services, or the infrastructure system of manufactured capital. And then thinking about this as a network, and credit to our co-researcher Megan Konar for these very good examples of data visualization. You can see on these diagrams, if you look at them carefully after you're kind of wowed at the beautiful patterns and colors, on the left is food flows among the 48 states. So for example, at the top, you can see Illinois is exporting an awful lot of food, but also importing it in the multicolored lines, a lot going to Louisiana, from which it's exported to the rest of the world. Now, by analyzing food flows and the embedded water or water footprint in those food flows, you can derive a virtual water trade network on the right. So for example, we can see that Texas, in the multicolored imported arrows, is a net virtual water importer, as is California, whereas Nebraska is a major net virtual water exporter. And so these kinds of networks are important in our analysis, because all the resources end up embedded in trade. Now, that diagram that we just looked at was at the state scale, but the selection of the right scale of analysis is really very important. So we can see, for example, on the graph on the upper left here, that internal virtual water flows are really small at the county scale. What that means is most virtual water leaves the county in which a food or an energy product was originally produced. At metropolitan scale, it's about 50-50, and at state scale, it's mostly about 3/4 internal transfers. Okay, what that tells us is that the county scale is going to capture most of the trade network because water embedded in food or energy is leaving the county where it was produced, and we can trace it through trade. So the county becomes a critical scale of analysis. We can see in these other graphs that states have functional differentiation as big importers or big exporters of virtual water, but that's even more true at the county scale, where some counties, some urban counties are incredibly large virtual water exporters, and some irrigated counties, for example, in the Central Valley of California, enormous exporters. So this is our argument for the mesoscale, that at the scale of counties and cities, we're seeing most of the action being imported and exported among those entities. So that's a little bit of an introduction from that paper in Ambio about some of the core concepts in our overall infusion project. We can address questions about those at the end. I think both Ben and I will be here to answer those questions. Moving now to part 2 in this presentation, I'm going to take just one little slice of that overall pizza on the infusion project and talk about a kind of footprinting that we'll see has an interesting relationship to water footprint and virtual water, and it's called human appropriation of net primary productivity. I'll call it HAMP from now on because that's way too many syllables. And what we want to do on this slide here simply is start by defining what HAMP is. So on this slide on the left, this bar here represents the net primary productivity of potential vegetation, or how productive an ecosystem could be if humans were not affecting it. Whereas this bar, which is usually shorter.
Actually don't have the answer to that. I would like to defer to Chris, since there are pre-publication results in those slides as to the terms of their distribution.
I think only the beginning part we can make available at this time because of what Ben said, that we have pre-publication results there. The beginning from the Ambio paper has been published, so we can make that part available.
Okay, thank you, Chris. Question 2. I'm curious about data availability in the Northeast, and I assume that's referring to the Northeast United States, such as, for instance, Massachusetts or Pennsylvania.
Yeah, we can go, we're right now doing a lot of data cleaning. There is some data there. It's heavily aggregated, and we can go back and look at some correlations and reproduce some of those data at the county scale. We were only looking at crop production at this point in time, and crop production is low in those states. And USDA aggregates data that are below a certain threshold. And so at this point, we've simply used those data, but we have a way of going back and looking at what the more refined data would have been had they not aggregated it. So that, it's work in progress. We can go back and reproduce those data, but they will be low. And the reason they're not shown is because they're lower in quantity than the ones we actually showed.
Thank you. Sticking with data questions, why do you think 2017 still doesn't have Northeast data? And or when do you think, or what lead time would you expect to have data available given these data sources?
Same answer. We'll be able to reproduce those data based on what they've done in past years. We just picked 2017 because it's the most 2016 and 2017 bracket the time span of the analysis. But we'll be able to go back, see what they did in other recent years and reproduce those data. They're just not as published every year in states and counties that have low agricultural production. For example, there's not a lot of corn grown in New Hampshire.
Thank you. Have you made a connection between soils and HAMP directly?
Not quantitatively, but there's clearly a relationship, and it's simply the relationship between suitability for crop production and soil. In other work, I've produced a habitat analysis, for example, let's say, corn as a quintessential example. And, the existence of corn, or put it this way, in the USDA cropland data layer, where they have 30 million pixels identified by crop, you can explain why a particular pixel has that crop. And it relates to a thermal window, a wetness or rainfall window, but also soil fertility and slope. So, things like soil fertility measures like pH, lower pH is better, available water capacity, cation exchange capacity are quantitatively and measurably related to the existence of these crops. So clearly what you're looking at is areas with the climate and soil and slope characteristics that are suitable for crop production end up in crop production and then end up big net HAMP exporters. So that's what I would hypothesize is behind those relationships, and pretty sure that would be correct.
Thanks, Chris. What are the implications of this analysis for how we should be managing food, energy, and water systems?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And, we're focused at, this first stage at the empirical questions of just quantifying everything so that we have a database from which we can start to analyze these management issues. I do think that the question of biofuels is very pertinent here. And biofuels are the only element of our energy consumption that's a direct HAMP harvest. Whereas, of course, fossil fuels are based on past photosynthesis, solar and wind come from current solar inputs. And so we really have to look at biofuels increase HAMP, which increases HAMP remaining, and then there's a cost to ecosystems from relying on biofuels rather than other forms of energy. I think that's one example. I think another example is how our ecosystems interrelated with each other. For example, Liz in Boston and everybody else who lives in Boston has a e-HAMP. They consume HAMP in the form of food, fiber, somewhat fuel, wood products, paper, and such. And through this kind of analysis, we can say what ecosystems enable a population in the Boston metropolitan area to survive with these, with the basic products that HAMP delivers. So we can actually map that. And so we can not only derive an ecological footprint, we can derive one that's very geographically specific. And so then there's going to be an interrelationship between the Boston metropolitan area and, let's say, Iowa. And we'll know exactly what that is. I also think if you can look at issues such as, and other footprint analyses tend to indicate the same thing, whereas meat products, beef products actually have higher water footprints, higher carbon footprints. I think they're also going to show to have a higher HAMP footprint. And so you can lower your HAMP footprint and increase hemp remaining through diet. So those are just a couple of examples.
Thanks, Chris. Can you clarify what ecosystem services or cultural services you are incorporating directly or indirectly through HAMP?
Yeah, that's a good question. And the MBO paper goes into the relationship between ecosystem services and some of these footprint measures. So the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment made an interesting differentiation of different kinds of ecosystem services. And they talked about provisioning ecosystem services, which are goods we consume. And so that concept is almost identical with hemp harvest. But then other kinds of ecosystem services are supporting, regulatory, and cultural. So, for example, when we look at that earlier map, and let's go back to the map of hemp remaining in the United States. This one here, I hope you can see that at this point. This is the net primary productivity that's still left after humans have impacted the landscape as well as harvested from it. And so, the question is, and it's an empirical ecological question, is do the green areas have a higher delivery of cultural ecosystem services, regulatory ecosystem services, supporting ecosystem services than the white areas that have little net primary productivity remaining, as well as biodiversity. So I think there's some relationships here that haven't yet been fully fleshed out that are interesting to pursue. So I hope that's where you're going with the question. But this is an interesting geographical distribution here on this map. There's a lot behind it.
Thank you. What spatial scale do you recommend for the analysis of food, energy, and water systems? Specifically, Hisham is interested in hydrology, HUC, watershed, agricultural, or political issues, but I think the question is general.
Yeah, well, that's a really good question for our study as a whole, and some of the analysis on this slide here really gets at that. And you have to think about both the trade network and the natural geographical areas from which resources are consumed, or interact. So we all know that watersheds are critical system boundaries with respect to water. However, watersheds don't mean anything when we're talking about trade. And so how do you manage that kind of intersection? I think is really what is the really important part of that question. But if you look at the graph on the upper left, okay, I think there's a lot there, because what it shows is that in virtual water is what's being measured here. And I know this is a CUAHSI crowd that is familiar with that concept, is that at the state scale, 80% of the virtual water stays within the state, okay? So most states are largely internal systems for virtual water, yet most counties are not. And there's a big difference, from 80%, I'll get back to that slide, from 80% down to about 5%. So really, that says that dividing up, and you can see the map on the bottom is the counties of the United States, there's about 3,000 of them, is that counties are very unself-sufficient, whereas states are much more self-sufficient. So if you want to look at what the dynamics are going on, and a lot of these dynamics are the interdependence between urban and rural areas. Okay, so cities are centers of consumption, whereas rural areas The blues that appeared on some of those maps are centers of production that sell what they produce to the cities. And those interrelationships in the network can really be captured at that county scale. Now, that doesn't mean that's the only scale that captures them, but given that we gather data on stuff within particular spatial units, and counties being one of them, there's a treasure trove of data at the county scale on how the trade network works and how production and consumption works. So that's a really good scale. Now, intersecting that with watersheds, what HUC level watershed is closest to a county scale? I don't know off the top of my head, but you could do a quick GIS analysis and say, well, we can look at this at say a HUC 8. That would be similar to the county scale. So that's the best answer I can give. But this mesoscale is an important part in thinking this problem through.
Okay, we have blitzed through our questions, and I think we're right on schedule. We're 48 minutes in, so I think this is a great place to end it. Thank you again to Chris for that really interesting and excellent talk. Everybody stay tuned and keep your eye on the Fusion website and on the literature for papers that are going to be coming out. And feel free to reach out directly to myself or Chris if you have any question or interest about collaborating with Fusion Project. Thanks again to CUAHSI, and I will cede control here. Thanks again, everybody. Bye.
Yep. And I also want to add, tune in next week on the 13th, same time, for Megan Konar's presentation on the food flows between counties in the United States. So same time, same place. And so everyone have a great day, and hopefully tune in next week.
Thank you.